Good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining me and our illustrious panel. Quick preview. If you're sitting here today, you're looking at your product and you want to improve it. How do you improve it? How do you level up? It's about inclusion. Everybody here has a platform, and when I say platform, I mean that literally and figuratively. Literally, you might have a platform for developers. Figuratively, you may have a social media group, you may have social media followers. The question is, how will you use that platform? How will you continue to improve that platform? You can use it for good by exposing systematic brutality, or like in the previous panel, creating more opportunities for affordable housing, or you can use it for bad, a la Roseanne. I won't go into detail about that, but if you're wondering, why are we talking about Roseanne during the inclusion panel? Search, look for it, and then you've already learned something. Without further ado, I'm gonna kick it over to our panelists so that they can introduce themselves and really tell their story. All right.
Sure, so I can start. Hi, my name is Charu, and I'm the founder and CEO of a young startup. We're about a year and a half old. We're called Next Play, and we work with tech companies like Lyft and Splunk to help them retain their employees. So often we see that for diverse talent, companies spend so much money on recruiting and getting that talent pipeline, or else on supporting women who are way senior to help them become VPs and senior VPs. But often early to mid-career professionals are neglected, so that's who we help. We help them connect with internal mentors and have effective career conversations. And it really started as a passion project. I used to work at LinkedIn before doing enterprise sales, where I had imposter syndrome, and I wouldn't ask to get promoted, and I wouldn't advocate for myself. And I started seeing a lot of patterns, and I started seeing how I'm competent but not confident. And so I started a mentoring program for women at LinkedIn specifically, and then that's where the seed was planted. But we've come a long way since, and yeah, I'm so excited to be here and chat with you, and thank you for this exposure.
No, thank you for coming out.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Brandon Anderson. I'm the founder and CEO of Rahim. Rahim. At Rahim, we help people document and share their experiences with police, positive and or negative, showing cities where policing works well and where it needs to improve. Yeah, happy to be here. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I'm Laura Bliss. I'm a staff writer at CityLab, which is part of the Atlantic magazine. So I'm a journalist. I don't work in the industry, but I do write about mapping, among other things, primarily write about transportation and urban space. But increasingly, I'm interested in mapping and data. Also write a newsletter called MapLab. You should all subscribe, which I think brought me to Shannon in this panel, which I'm really glad to be on.
All right, folks, now that we've gotten the formalities out of the way, I'm gonna open up with questions, and I don't start with softball, so hold on to your seats. Brandon, I wanna start with you. Inspiration can come from the darkest of places. Could you tell me about how Rahim came to life and what was sort of the impetus for that?
Yeah, great. Well, it's starting off dark, right, Shannon? How many people have ever been in love before? Raise your hand. Great, okay, that's a good amount of people. How many people are still in love? Great, okay, this is awesome. This is even better. Well, I fell in love for the first time when I was 15 years old. And like many of you, it was like falling asleep in class. It's something I didn't mean to do, but I just did. I was 15 years old. I was living homeless in an abandoned house in the middle of Oklahoma City for 2 years. And I'd fell in love with my best friend from grade school, middle school, and from high school. And in 2006, my best friend became my partner. He asked me to marry him, and it was, without a doubt, the happiest day of my life. In 2007, I was in the Army. I had joined in 2003 after 9/11. And I got a call from a mutual friend of ours who had said, hey, Brandon, I don't know how to tell you this, but your partner's been shot. He was killed by the Oklahoma City Police Department. And so in 2007, I lost my lifetime partner, my best friend, to police violence during a routine traffic stop. His love was radical, unapologetic, and it changed my life. And it is the loss of his love and his life that catapulted me into the work that I do today. But really, it's, like many of you, it's the love of my current partner that continues to sustain me in this work. But quite frankly, it's the right that each of us have to live and to love in a world free of police violence that continues to inspire me in this work. So I'm happy to have conversations around that. Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. That's the really interesting thing about diversity. People talk about a diversity of perspectives and experiences. That's what I think about. That diverse experience is about overcoming adversity. My next question is for Laura. There's this idea that there's this diversity of perspectives, and that's what matters, right? Why would it matter that a woman made a map? Why would it matter that a person of color is using data to expose social injustices? What do you think is the difference here between perspectives and versus actually having people from different backgrounds?
Right. Again, I can speak to this only as a journalist, right, who covers maps, among many other things, but I'm really interested in how decision makers, map makers, and sometimes, right, the people who are gathering the data that winds up in the map, how the kind of paradigms that they're working in, the way that they see the world, right, ultimately gets reflected back into the map. And sometimes that means like their biases, right, which may be conscientious or not. Sometimes it's like the data that's available, which may be available for all kinds of reasons. And I'm particularly interested in not only how that shows up on the map, but the very material, real-world consequences that has for people in the real world. Often because they haven't been included in that data or in that sort of paradigm. And there's lots of examples of why it matters, I think, that I've come across. So one of the kind of classic ones, maybe some of you are familiar with in this room, comes from the OpenStreetMap community that I learned about a couple of years ago, and that was the big childcare tag controversy. Anybody familiar with that? See a couple hands raised. Cool. So this was a big debate between 2011 and 2013 in the OSM community, of which 2 to 5% are women, so the people who edit OSM. And there hasn't been a study about, in terms of like racial diversity or other kinds of folks who make up the OSM editing community, but we know that few of the mappers participating are women. So anyways, there was a big controversy about whether to include childcare facilities as a tag on the map, one that lasted for 2 years, a debate between editors. And I'm actually not completely clear on what the controversy was. I believe, there was a sense from the majority of the map makers, right, that like, well, healthcare and schools sort of encompasses the needs of, someone who's looking for childcare, but the women in the community, and also men, right, who were parents or thinking about this, were like, no, this is like a completely different issue. So that can have really real consequences for somebody who's searching for that service. And even in a higher stakes context, right, like in a developing world context, if you don't have a bathroom that's tagged, for women specifically, that could be actually pretty dangerous. So those are a couple of examples.
All right, and thanks for bringing in that international context. A lot of time, inclusion, diversity, and belonging really sticks to the United States, and it's much bigger than that. It's almost absurd that we don't talk more about the international aspect, given that the majority of tech companies today are global. Charu, thank you so much for working on mentoring. Like, I couldn't have sat here today without constant mentorship from my mother, from people I've met in different walks of life. But mentorship seems to be a general thing, right? Everybody needs mentorship. Like, sure, President Obama had mentorship and so on and so on. What makes this sort of like an inclusion issue or an inclusion solution?
Yeah. So I grew up in a family in India where women are not allowed to work. And we all share our stories to varying degrees, and we all bring baggage and imposter syndrome and various levels of support systems to the workforce. But once we get there, especially for the millennial generation, we grew up with all this counseling and coaching, and then you get to the workforce, and there's no support system for you, right? And there is a massive vacuum that companies are not catering to, and you're on your own. It's on you to identify the right next career move, or how to find the right sponsors, the right mentors. Yeah. Now, what happens in that system is when it's left to serendipity, or just organic relationships, biases creep in. Powerful people take under their wing people who look like them, right? So there is this bias from the mentors. Now from the mentees or the sponsorees, we have a lot of imposter syndrome. Where do I begin with? I don't even know my goals. Who do I go and talk to? They're so busy. Why will they mentor me? And so the idea is that the more systems we create in the workforce, the more equality we can create, whether it be for mentorship or sponsorship or just opening doors for career advancement. But that's the idea, and that's why I think inclusive mentorship. So we don't just sell for women, not just female employees. In fact, I think it's really important to include everyone. That's when true inclusion happens. Yes. But that's why I think inclusive mentorship is very, very crucial for companies, and it's important to build these systems at scale.
Interesting. Great point. So inclusion is a company-wide thing. It's not just minorities in the company trying to move inclusion. It's something that we have to unite and do, correct?
Yeah. And like you were saying, diversity comes in many forms. So I'm a woman, but I'm also a person of color, and I have an Indian accent. And when I was doing sales, I would make these calls, and people would hang up on me thinking I'm calling from some call center. And there are all these little things that we don't think about, but everyone has their own battle they're fighting every day, and everyone has their own story. And you have no idea because they've told you only so much.
Right. Brandon, earlier, that kind of reminds me of something. We were talking about how, now it may seem small that someone walking down the street is called a racial epithet by a police officer. But I noticed that you track, did you feel disrespected? So when you submit the form, you can say, was I disrespected by the police officer? Or even then, did the officer listen to what I had to say? Did I feel heard? For instance, I was last night I was kind of looking online, and I saw that there was a woman who said, I called the police and I felt like I was heard. So that's a positive thing. It's interesting that you track that. Like, I love looking at that data. What are your plans for that data? Like, how will you move social change?
Yeah, so a couple of things I wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Charu was saying, just around the job of inclusivity being not just singled to racial minorities or to women. And I take that really to heart, quite frankly, because I think that the problem of taking into context the problem of, for instance, sexism and misogyny is really not the problem of women. Women have to deal with it, but it's a problem that was created by men, and we have to be clear about that. And so that is the problem of men, and so our job is to take part in ensuring that that actually stops, right? I mean, that's not the problem of women, that's something we add on. I think the complications come into place in how do we take part in that work without taking space away from women. I think that there's a complicated structure around that, but quite frankly, just the way racism is not the problem of black and brown people, right? Racism is the problem of white supremacy and systems that discriminate against people of color. And so it's people who have privilege in either of those spaces or in any space of the power elite and dominant that dominate the culture of taking part in deconstructing that culture. How do we track, and so in that context, how do we use data to help understand policing? So a couple of things that we found. One, that 60%, so we basically help people, anybody, share and document their experiences with police, positive or negative, or anything in between. And we launched a pilot in San Francisco and in Berkeley last year for 3 months. And in 3 months, we collected twice as much data as the cities of San Francisco and Berkeley had done in a year, combined. That's when Obama wrote us a check. But I think the idea around that was, who are these systems working for and who is actually doing that? Because if you take it into consideration, it was 6 of us, 6 volunteers working at, they were senior engineers and designers working at top tech companies, but they were doing this part-time. So 6 volunteers in part-time hours, working for some of the most demanding tech companies in the country, were able to collect twice as much data in half the time as 2 city governments.
Why
That
is that?
Well, frankly, it's where are we placing our resources? And the other thing is that there's a problem around just who we trust. And so all of that taken into context, when you ask me the question about what do we do with that data, there are a couple of things we found. 60% of people who experience positive policing are white, straight men who live in wealthier neighborhoods with high property values. We really didn't need that much data to tell us that. We know that.
If any at all.
20 to 30% of that, those experiences, negative experiences, were experienced by African American and Latina and sometimes Native American men. And in the most increasing number who feel most harassed and not heard are Black women, right? We also didn't need very much data to prove that. So I think what do we do with that data? We help cities understand where policing works well and where it can be improved. Not only in the minute, this is what Officer Johnson did, but also on a systematic issue. We don't believe that officers are bad apples. We think that there is a system that continues to cultivate, nurture, and condition those bad apples. So even if removing and rehabilitating those bad apples is successful, we still have a system that continues to cultivate bad apples. So our structural problem, our problem is not an individual problem, it's a structural problem. So with the data, what we're able to do is understand the entire structure. And currently, cities can't do that, frankly, because 93% of people who experience police violence don't report it, because they don't trust the system, and to file any sort of complaint or compliment, it's unnecessarily difficult and often intimidating. So we come in to make sure that that doesn't happen, and we've been fairly successful, but I think that that's primarily because people trust us more, and it's easier. We just make it easy. Yeah.
Right. Sometimes it's just a matter of making it easier. Sometimes that actually is a solution. It's about being thoughtful and intentional about what the solution could be. Laura, I think you've written a lot about transportation in general, not just about women mapping the world. But what I would love to hear about is some of the solutions that you've come across in your research to having this lack of representation in OSM, which is the core. If you're working in location search and data, that could be the core of your product. So it starts there. What are some solutions that you've started to see?
Yeah. Solutions, it's a tough word, right? Because like there are unintended consequences of like everything. Right? It's hard to say like when one thing has like an endpoint and it's a solution or not. But I think that to your point and to the point of this panel, including the people who are being mapped, and this is just like a very generalized statement, including people who are being mapped in the map seems like a good thing to do from what I've observed. And also like asking kind of deeper questions of the data. So one thing that comes to mind, so I'll just say the child care tag in the OSM story, that was eventually added, I think, thanks to the mappers and editors, I think many of whom were women, not only women, men too, and people who didn't identify with either gender, pushing for that. So having that voice included in that mapping community, I think is a good thing. And then kind of other examples, right? So, I write about urban policy, mostly transportation, but this is kind of housing related to the other panel. There has been a big push for more data-driven city policy, right? So I'm thinking about in Louisville, Kentucky, there's a lot of blight, right, abandoned housing, and the current mayor has had a big push in the concept of using data, right, to show, okay, where are the abandoned houses, which neighborhoods should we sort of target, who should we be sort of holding accountable, and so they did this big push and showed, okay, all of the, or 50% of the abandoned houses are in this particular neighborhood in Louisville. And it was like the neighborhood that everybody already knew. It was like, yeah, there's a lot of abandoned housing there. And they did like a heat map. And this is now the city's sort of data-driven, data-backed map that's going to help them target their resources, right, or their attack on blight, as it were. And there was lots of community-based responses to this mapping project one of which was an organization that no longer exists, unfortunately, but they sort of took it upon themselves. It was a neighborhood group, sort of grassroots organization, that took it upon themselves to look at the data more closely. And part of what they found was that, in fact, a majority of the properties that were in this neighborhood that were abandoned had owners. They looked this up just in the property records, had owners all over the country, in Dallas and Washington, D.C., I mean, in suburbs outside of Louisville, too. And a lot of the addresses didn't even match up, which suggested many of the people who own the properties didn't actually live there at any point. So when the question is, who are we holding accountable for this neighborhood that's totally blighted, and some people call it a slum, right? It turns out maybe it's a whole community of slumlords who doesn't even live in this city. So I think that's an example of talking to people in the neighborhood in that instance, right, who actually knew some history of the properties.
Yep.
And for example, we've never had a neighbor there. I think that's kind of telling.
Would you say that that's sort of similar to the concept of combining data with intuition, right? It takes people on the ground to really understand what's happening there. Would you say that that would be the solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think that seems to be a good thing. The data can't. I mean, one set of data is just one set of data. It's not going to tell the full story.
Yeah, I also.
Brandon, you want to add to that?
Right. Yeah. Actually, that's really interesting. I love to chat more. I'm also very cautious of how we use data, because it can be. I mean, it could be a bad thing. I mean, data is not, it can be used for anything. But I also want to take into consideration when we ask people for data to help them solidify or validate a concern that they might have. Take, for instance, how much data do we know about, school shootings? Right? I mean, I don't know how much data we know, but I do know that there were several town halls that took place after the shooting in Florida. You didn't ask us for data. You didn't ask us for, whether we needed to think more broadly about how many kids. We said, hey, there was a shooting, people died, and we need to change the way we write policy for gun laws. It's crazy how when it comes to talking about communities that are marginalized, particularly Black and brown communities, when those communities are marginalized, we ask for data. Hey, give us this data. I want to know this, this data point about how policing works. I was like, no, we've been telling you since 1978 that policing in this country is racist, right? It's very clear, right? We don't, great, we have 28, 29, 30 years of history. And the fact is that policing in this country started by catching slaves and returning them to masters for them to perform additional duties.
All right, taking us to school today,
I'm just
Brandon.
saying, so if we're thinking about the history of policing, it started in a very archaic system that supported white, straight men. And so if we're asking now for data, I mean, I'm going to play this game because that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to play it to the best of its ability. Obama taught me that. But I think primarily our issue is just around, let's be clear about when we ask and when we challenge people to give us data to reinforce what we've already heard, when we don't really ask those same questions for people in power.
So speaking of, I think you've started to touch on the concept of prove it and prove it again, right? And if for anyone who's unfamiliar with that, what that means is that minority communities, women, transgender, people of color, have to prove themselves and then prove it again and again. It's not enough that the majority of the Black and brown community is saying, we have a problem with police brutality. We have to prove it and prove it again before anything happens. Speaking of which, Charu, mentoring is a big part of Mapbox, which is the company I work for. Some of the feedback has been like, mentoring means everything to me, but I am feeling like because I am not evaluated on this, I'm evaluated on whether I deliver on this product, whether I make these deadlines, and whether I'm present and get FaceTime with the right people. I feel like mentorship in the end could actually hinder my career growth. What does Next Play do to mitigate that? And then second, two-part question. Sorry to hit you so hard here. What can tech leaders do to make sure that mentorship is institutionalized in performance evaluations or encouragement, whether it's just speaking and doing some internal PR on mentorship? What can they do to improve that?
Sorry, to clarify, why do they say it hinders their career growth?
Because they say, well, I'm not evaluated on how much I mentored the intern in our organization.
Incentives for mentors.
Yes.
Got it.
Incentives, but more so like making sure they get the right support they need and know that this is as important as other parts of their organization.
Yeah. So I see we have 6 minutes.
All of that.
Can you do it in
two?
Yeah. It's a movement and it's a mindset shift. We're a small team of 5 people. And when we go to investors, they keep asking, why is this a painkiller? It's a nice to have. But no, it's not. Because now the workforce is demanding for mentorship and companies have to give it. And you just cannot get away without doing that. So it's on vendors like us to translate the value of mentorship into ROI and then prove to decision makers why it's a compelling business case and tie it to performance levels, engagement, retention. So our first pilots, after 6 months, employees felt twice as equipped to achieve their goals at their company because they had an internal mentor. That translates to performance, engagement, right? 25% more employees now strongly recommend working for their company, which means referrals, retention, all those good things, which are need-to-haves. But then anytime we acquire a new client, we only do it if there is a strong executive sponsor. So I think it's great that you're doing it at, what, 300, 400 employees now?
We're at 400 people.
That's amazing.
And
That's
this was
great.
actually built out by members of our Mapbox team on the technical division. This is not like an HR initiated. This is people initiated. So
That's fantastic.
I hate shameless plug here, but yes, that is one thing about our company is that we really empower our individual contributors to create programs and build people, generate energy, and kind of get things going. So, all right, final word. If there's anybody in the audience right now who's looking to be inclusive with their product, who's looking to do more, trying to figure out what story to tell, what would you tell them? This is open to anyone on the panel. Feel free to jump in.
And they're looking to do what again?
Looking to improve their product. What would you say would be their first step? Let's go with that.
Improve their product just generally?
Yeah, improve their product, but from an inclusive lens.
Yeah.
I'm a journalist, so I'm going to just extract myself from that question.
She'll write the hot take if you don't improve your product. So FYI.
So I would say 2 things. One, as a founder, I know that I am accountable to my investors and shareholders, right? And so while, I mean, I have deep empathy for this. That's why I started this company. But at the end of the day, I have to show a high-growth, profitable business model. So the more and more you can tie your diversity case to your consumer base or a business case, that's really appreciated because then that becomes sustainable. It's not a nice to have, right? You don't have to rely on your CEO or CTO being a nice person. So that's the biggest thing I would say. And the second, it comes back to the team. I think thinking about the right formation of your culture, your company, your team really starts on day 0. You cannot wait until you have 100 engineers and then you start to think, shit, these are all white men. What do I do? And then no one wants to join the team, right? So it really has to start on day 0. So I would say these 2 things. So business case and right team.
All right, Brandon.
Yeah, wow. So is it okay to like disagree?
Of course. What would this be without disagreement?
I don't care if you have a business case for including marginalized groups in your company or not, whether you profit from it in any capacity. You don't have to prove that to me. I think making an inclusive space for all people in your company should just be like the bottom, right? I mean, that is foundational, even outside of whether it makes you money or not. And so I think if money comes, great. But I think the need to tie it to this overall business model, oftentimes, especially if you fail in that area, because the system of capitalism takes to the extent and understands and let me say this nicely, capitalizes on the labor of poor people of color. And so if your business model doesn't fit in ensuring that those groups are elevated, like, I don't want you to not do it because it doesn't fit your business model. I don't care if it fits your business model. I think you need to have a CEO in that position to understand that whether it helps or not, this is the core competency of what it is that you do as an organization, and you're going to ensure that that exists regardless of what sort of backdrop you get in the financial and in your balance sheet.
And with that said, I'll let that be the mic drop. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for sharing your truth. We have about 40-something seconds left and winding down, but we're going to stick around the stage to answer questions. So thank you all so much for coming out. Thanks. Peace.